So the baby Reverend has very recently started insisting that girl Stacy needs to come over and play girl Stacy. And it took me a minute to realize he's talking about Spider Gwen, Gwen Stacy. He seems to be developing his first cartoon crush. I mean, as far as a 3-year-old or almost 3-year-old can crush on somebody, but super funny. He just keeps like or girl Stacy, big girl Stacy, come home play. I show Gwen Stacy cars. Um, so he is so ready to wow Gwen Stacy with his toys. And it's funny because his birthday's coming up. So now I'm very suddenly going, I wonder if there's any babysitters in the area that like has this costume that just wants to come play for like an hour. Like I would, because I think like full bore hiring an entertainer, I don't think he's there yet. And I don't think that's necessary. I think he legit would be disappointed if Gwen Stacy came over and did anything other than play in his play area with him. Like I think that's top notch what he wants.
Well, I do believe there are plenty of hoodies out there that someone could buy that would make them look like Spider Gwen, kind of like me with my Spider Man hoodie myself that he really enjoys now, instead of that look of, oh my god.
Like, what am I even taking in right now? But yeah, so super exciting. Guess I might be pivoting from a Handyman Hal birthday to a Spider-Man birthday, which is great because there's so many accoutrement. Like, easy grab accoutrement versus Handyman Hal would have been a lot of making it myself. So, but I love how he's become a little bit more aware this morning. He was like, record with Tim. And I'm like, yeah, I'm recording with Tim today. And I don't know if it's because he's actually interested in my schedule or if he has a vested interest in if he's going to get to watch red videos today. So.
Whatever works, right?
Oh yeah, I mean he is an active monkey. That is very very for sure. The baby Reverend is like that. But lately, unfortunately, there's not a lot of Spider Gwen material out there. There's the little Disney Spidey friends. But of course, in true the baby Reverend fashion, that is too childish for his entertainment quality. So he wants real people, which is kind of nice because developmentally that is better for him. Like to see real people doing stuff over cartoons that can accidentally be high stimulus, even if they don't look high stimulus. Like you almost need to know what to watch for. But we had found this silly YouTube channel. It's basically a bunch of people in different Spider-Man costumes, like all different colors, some that I've seen from Spider-Verse stuff, some that's just like, I don't know, I guess there was a green Spider-Man costume. I know Venom, black, like I'm not super into that world and I'm not going to pretend to be, but he's been super into it. And I think it's just a very nonverbal, it's very clearly like there's a problem, there's a silly bad guy, there's a resolution and all this stuff. So we've been kind of filling the gap of a lack. I guess the baby Reverend would like to formally request, anybody in the Marvel world, that happens to be listening to our podcast, like if you could just make a Gwen Stacy movie, like about the Spider Woman, he would be super thrilled.
Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse has Spider-Gwen. It is a cartoon
Yes.
though, but there is that. I would say be careful with some of the Gwen Stacy stuff because in the comics she does end up dying. And I believe in one of the Amazing Spider-Man movies, I think they actually did kill off that character. So that would be the one note of caution there in terms of the Gwen Stacy for his age currently.
Well, that's fine. This kid seems to have a high tolerance. He watched, we already watched the Spider Verse. He watched, Peter Parker die. He has already seen Spider Man, the live action movies. So he's handled those well. That's actually what made me okay with him watching this silly little YouTube channel. 'Cause it's so funny that they have it flagged, like not for children. But as I looked into it, I guess channels will do that to cover their asses. Like it's not necessarily because everything about it is like, wait a second, but this is like there's a cartoon called Grizzy and the Lemmings that I was introduced to like a long time ago by my adoptive dad. It's on Netflix. It's basically it's the same thing. There's clear characters who have back and forth, if you want to call it protagonist, antagonist, good guy, bad guy, whatever. They have some kind of nonverbal back and forth, but kids learn a lot about that because they don't always understand what's being said anyway. So there actually is something developmental to these things that seem like dumb shows, because I felt bad that he had found it at first, because I was like, this feels like really dumb. And then it causes me to look into it, and then I learn, oh, this is actually very appropriate storytelling, because there's a clear good guy, silly bad guy scenario. Yeah, they fight, but he's seen more intense shit watching Arcane, over her shoulder or something, because he really likes like the colors, I guess, and then whatever. But he doesn't do much for cartoons. But he's really enjoyed the Spider-Man universe. So it's kind of hard, because when a kid glams onto something, good luck telling them to shut it off. Like, you almost just have to find like the friendly version of it, or beware the tantrums for however long. Like, those are the two options. Like, you just have to pick, like, really. And so looking into it, and I watched a lot of it with him, and it seems like the exact formula for just nonverbal storytelling for kids. So it's kind of funny, because the Mr. Bishop, or the baby, gosh, I will get my brother's name right. The Bishop, Chris, was the one kind of giving me some shit about it at first, like, way to introduce him to some Elsa Gate quality stuff. And I'm like, oh, Elsa Gate was a very specific thing that happened, but don't need to go into that today. That can be something that our friends can Google if they want to.
Or a future episode. Hey, yeah.
Maybe we'll cover Elsa Gate.
Yeah. Well, speaking of friends, they are here. Welcome, everyone, to Friends Talking Nerdy. This is Tim the Nerd, and joining me is the Reverend Tracy. And we will have maybe the baby Reverend pop up every now and then saying hi or something like that in the background. But this week, we have another interesting topic brought to us by the Reverend Tracy. Why don't you let us know what it is?
So basically, we spent a whole episode talking about dismissing psychology as still being in its infancy, being kind of motivated skepticism. And today I realized we can use that exact same lens on something else. And that is the idea that adults are supposed to move out at 18 and live independently. I am talking about the experiment of the nuclear family, because that is actually something that's in its infancy that I realized we seem to trust way more sometimes than psychological or scientific findings. So, why not talk about that? What happened in the history to the multi-generational home, and kind of really emphasizing this idea that the nuclear family is an experiment, and spoiler alert, it's failing.
Yeah, especially in this economy. I mean, there is that stigma, I guess, of people still living at home with their mother and all that stuff, which does seem to affect, guys in the dating world, and everything. People can't afford to move out. I mean, like the studio apartment I had in my 20s that cost me $250 a month is now about $1,500 a month. Last time I checked on one of those apartment.com type sites to see if it was still out there. Obviously, inflation from the mid 90s to today means that there would be some increase in price, but from 250 to 1,500 is just insane.
Well, we're going to learn that that might not have as much to do with it as we thought. It actually kind of looks like that the current situation is more just proving that it didn't work. And actually, our current economic situation, some of our mental health epidemic situations, seem to have been caused by this post World War II experiment. And so historians and sociologists actually do use the word experiment for this. I'm not using that to be ironic or silly, talking about the shift to the nuclear household, because it was a deliberately constructed, historically unprecedented social arrangement. It was not an evolution of human behavior or need. It seems to have really come down to policy decisions that made it look like it was very achievable, and therefore we got sold that it's very achievable through policies and programs, and our good old friend normalization through our television, which was becoming bigger at the time. The term the term nuclear family didn't even exist until 1924. We're going to talk about the dates that we drew around in our psychology episode. This is definitely the younger thing. This is definitely the younger concept, and it was coined by an anthropologist Slaw. I'm not even going to try the last name. Tim, do you have any clue? Malinowski. But the concept of independent living as a developmental milestone. The idea that living at home at 18 is a sign of healthy, or that leaving the home at 18 is actually a sign of healthy adulthood. But that is all post World War II American culture, and it is at most 80 years old. So, applied to all of human history, like it's not even a rounding error to say that this is definitely a concept that is very young in our human species.
Agreed. I mean, and with as much crap as people give for psychology, of course, still claiming it's in its infancy. This is something that you would think in our society in America, at least, it's something that has always been there. Which even a cursory look in like grade school history books will show that that is just not the case, because back in the day, before the industrial age hit, it kind of wasn't possible.
Exactly. Like multi-generational living was actually the default setting for civilization. Like basically like for the vast majority of human history, across virtually every culture on earth, multiple generations living under one roof or in immediate proximity was just simply how humans lived. Right? It wasn't because we were less evolved or less independent, even though that's often how I feel like it's been pitched to us, right? But because it worked. It distributed labor, there's shared resources, knowledge transfer, provided care across the lifespan in ways that isolated households simply can't. You want to sit here and talk about how we have issues with elder care, child care, etc. It seems like this was the beginning of a lot of that because nobody stressed out about waiting lists for childcare just like 50 years ago, right? Because we were still kind of early on into it. Maybe not everybody was into it, but like these weren't problems. The idea of an elderly person living all by themselves and therefore requiring a bunch of support to do so was not a problem. That is something that we'll find kind of got fabricated through policy, as I kind of said, like right up at the beginning, right?
Imagine that. I mean, and it wouldn't shock me if politicians involved were more on the conservative bent too, that kind of pushed that. But I'm sure we'll probably come across some names when that time comes.
Basically, it goes back to like this didn't exist, which is crazy. Like, it's so interesting to me how we'll take something and look at how it worked for all of human history. And someone can make like just the right pitch and it can totally turn that over and make it feel like that's the backwards thing. Like in ancient Rome, for example, the concept of the nuclear family as we know it did not exist. The Latin word for familia actually translates closer to household than family, and it included multiple generations, extended kin, clients, and sometimes freed slaves all under one legal and economic unit. So, yeah, like that's even more expansive than we realized. That had almost like a chosen family or an adoptive family situation, like that people did take in freed slaves into their households because oftentimes they were severely displaced from people, right? So they kind of even built it around, right? So they would have these huge units. Work was largely displaced across everybody. There were no burnt out mommies trying to do everything, or I should say the burnt out stay at home parent, because that demographic is switching. So I'm sorry to my dudes out there who also stay home and work your asses off, because that job is like the equivalent of 5 or something like that when you are a stay at home person, especially when there is a kid involved. That is multiple levels of doing one job.
Think too of the fact that back in Roman days, obviously they did not have the technology that we had in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, in today to be able to pull off some of the stuff we do. Like I see, like right behind you, you have I'm assuming an electric stove and a microwave and a fridge. Obviously they didn't have that back in the Roman days, so they needed extra help to be able to cook the food, to be able to store the food simply. And
Right.
having it be like one family with adult kids that are moved out, like would make it extremely hard to be able to survive. And, you got to think too, this is probably at a time where even probably poorer people had a lot more land than, they do necessarily today. And, who's going to take care of that land? Who's going to take care of the animals that are on that land? Because back in the day, you probably did need at least a cow, probably more. You needed a chicken or probably more to be able to have access to different types of foods and everything. And, if you're just one family trying to take care of that, good luck.
Exactly. There was a show that the Mr. Reverend and I watched called Back to the Frontier, and three families joined together in the wilderness to live as 1800s homesteaders. And you get to really see how much was involved because one of the challenges they had to do was fill their winter storage. So it was up to them. They could process meat and try to find ways to keep it. They could process their vegetables, a lot of pickling, a lot of learning how to do stuff. They even had to do things like make stuff to go sell to the grocery store. Like it was really cool how they like sneaky kind of taught some history about homesteading and what that meant to people, particularly Black community and homosexual community, which is great because they actually did have that. They had a Black family that got to learn that that was a lot of the way that freed slaves, like figured out how to live life. But it very much involved having their family. Like having fewer people really hurt you back then because you needed more hands on deck. You needed people who could go work the field while other people were figuring out how to pickle the harvest, while other people were figuring out how to dry the jerky well enough but still retain fat because they judged it by that. It wasn't just like filling this pantry. You had to have like the variety of stuff for these like professional there's like a historian and I think somebody who also actually does homesteading, because there are still people who live that way. But it was extremely fascinating, and you can see how quickly that would have fallen apart if they didn't have like the whole family there to back them up, the many hands to contribute. And that even goes to kind of your point about refrigeration. You can't make your 20 freezer meals to throw in the crock pot, Carol. You can't have your one big bulk thing that you made for breakfast to feed the family for the week, Susan. That didn't exist back then. That is all new. And that is all part of, I mean, those are great things to have. Don't get me wrong, right? Having the technology isn't the problem. But imagine if we had still all this technology, but had retained something that has worked since the beginning of time. Because it really goes down to the multi-generational home was not just economic necessity, it was also a social operating system.
Which we needed back at that time. I mean, we didn't have some of the, like you've already mentioned, some of the help that we do have for let's say older people that do need some sort of assistance to be able to get through the day, or child care. I mean, because even if it was a situation back in the day to where a young woman, let's say, was a single parent, at least she still lived with her parents and, would still be able to get help at that particular time and not have to, worry about a babysitter or something like that, if that was even a concept back in the 1800s or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, you might have like the some of the maids and stuff that help, like what was the milkmaid? I think that was one of them, like that did some of the breastfeeding sometimes. But no, like babysitting, like there was no care.com to find somebody to come watch your kid, right? Like it was very much done by that tribe. If not, I mean, usually it seemed like it was fulfilled immediately in the home, right? Because when you have a plethora of people in your home, it's really easy to be like, hey, you're staying home with the kid, right? We're going to go out and we're going to go till the field. We're going to go do whatever. We're going to go, I don't know, have a date night. Not that that always existed as highly back then, but, but it didn't just make that possible. In a way, you were also baked into having like social arrangements and being more social because you had more people in your home, right? It's like living in the dorms versus living in like an apartment with two roommates versus living by yourself, right? Like, one, you think about living in dorm life, that's probably some of your most social years because you're living in a huge system, right? And you got a lot of people like kind of in your near vicinity. But I also feel like that's part of what's ripped us away from some of the stuff that's caused a lot of 18 plus year olds to be starting off in a lot of debt, though. Because, right, you're living around a bunch of peers. You're not living around people who have like real world knowledge to help steer you. You've actually been separated from that. But that's probably getting a little into stuff that I'll get more into later on in the notes. But yeah, like a lot of people really tend to look at multi generational living and assume that it was purely out of survival, that people lived together because they had to, and it's assumed that if they had the choice that they would live independently. That assumption projects our current values backwards. In most historical cultures, the extended household wasn't a compromise, it was the goal. Status, identity, and security were embedded in that household structure. So it kind of makes sense when you think about that, though, right? Like, it was kind of this, it was a good thing. It kind of goes back to this weird idea that we've taken that the lone wolf is a good thing. Typically,
Oh,
somebody living by themselves, not great, not a good sign. That was a red flag.
yeah, I mean, for as much as I enjoy my solitude, I think I do thrive better with people that are, like prodding me, like get up and do something.
Exactly. But like, even so, outside of like thinking it was a necessity, it's like thinking about what did the extended household actually provide that we now outsource entirely to institutions. I already kind of touched on it, right? Childcare, elder care, knowledge transfer across generations, because now we're paying for it. Look at how in colleges now we have electives for balancing your checkbook, for cooking, for like there's driving school, like teaching people to drive. Like that was, I feel like that easily is something we remember being something that parents taught you, is driving and early, balancing your checkbook or doing some of the finances and some of the home ec, right? Also, economic safety nets, social belonging, mental health support. Like, because think about it, when you have multiple people in a home, there's probably at least one person you can talk to when you're struggling with something. At least. And then ideally, multiple that you can do problem solving with.
Well, also some of the things that you mentioned too, at least back in the day, were covered by schools, like home ec classes. That used to be a thing to where, in like high school or something, if you took home ec, they would teach you how to like bake or, do whatever. And, they would also have other classes that would teach you basic skills. But guess what? Budget cutbacks on public schools helped take away a lot of that stuff, depending on where the public school was. If it was a more rich neighborhood, I'm sure they had a lot more options. And I'm not talking about private schools or charter schools or anything like that, just strictly public schools. Like, at least back in the day, there were some other options to learn this stuff. But now, to your point, like, you'll have a lot of people that were like me hitting 18, and it's like, good luck in your new place learning how to cook. I mean, my cooking skills have gotten slightly better from, age 19 when I first moved out, but that's still not good. Just because I can cook a box of macaroni and cheese pretty well doesn't make me an expert chef.
Right. And while, right, the multi generational home wasn't necessarily out of economic necessity, but think of all of those things now, right? Like every one of those functions now requires either significant money or a formal institution to cover it. And to your point, high school did cover it, but now more and more we're losing some of these classes. Like I'm not even sure home ec is required anymore.
Or even
Um,
offered.
or even, right, if it's even offered, right? So it's just really crazy because the multi-generational home just naturally provided for those things, right? Like we didn't know how much of a need it would even become until we took it away.
I mean, think about how beneficial home ec would be in a high school in a neighborhood that's kind of like low income or something like that. Like it sounds like on the one hand, it may sound like condescending or something like that, but teaching young people who aren't economically advantaged, little things like how to make food from like make like a cake of something on their own and not via a Betty Crocker box. You know, they're going to be able
Right.
to save a lot of money that way. Or learning, like, one thing, I'm almost 50, and I'm sure it could be easy to learn. And I've been stubborn in a lot of ways to, not learn this process. But imagine what it would be teaching young people how to cook something as simple as rice, how much that
Right.
could save them a lot of money. And yet you have a lot of people that are not taught that simple thing about, having basic, because rice can go a long way.
Right, and what kind of rice you're making? Are you making it in an instant cooker or the stovetop? Is it a long grain, short grain? But these are the things like millennials have been very outspoken about is because a lot of us were raised in homes too, and this is kind of compiling on this issue, by the way, where the message was let them be kids. Right, because prior generations had it so hard, you should just let them be kids. But the problem with that is it also intersects with this idea that we're supposed to just be done at 18, that we just get out. And so a lot of us were sent into the world with like no skills.
Me.
No skills. Yeah, no cooking skills. I remember my bio mom used to proudly brag about how she had her dogs and her children trained that if she was cooking, our feet were on the carpet and not the tile. And that meant we were strictly trained to stay the fuck out of her way. And that became more important than letting us be there, letting us learn just by watching. And now what's cool is we can compensate for that, but it's sad that we ever had to. And then what sucks is now that we are the parents, we desperately want, a lot of us want to correct this, but there is just so much like media information and kind of media normalization that you're fighting that, and it's getting earlier. Right? Like think of all of like the kids shows that even kind of support this dynamic of parents versus kids. I think it starts that early because it gets them to want to move out at 18. And the thing is we are also creating a loneliness epidemic with this. There's an anthropologist named David Sloan Wilson, and he did a medieval selection theory that suggests that humans evolved as a cooperative species specifically adapted to live in kin groups. And the neurobiological research on loneliness shows that chronic loneliness activates the same threat responses as physical danger. We've talked a lot about how our brain takes a lot and goes, you may as well be punching me in the face. And loneliness can basically be the pervasive, like, every day. But it does make more sense when you understand that isolation from kin networks is evolutionarily speaking a very recent and very abnormal condition for a human being to be in. And I love this quote that I found from Susan Pinker, and it's called The Village Effect from 2014. And it says, isolated nuclear family cut off from kin as a very recent and peculiar arrangement in human history. And I just thought that was such a great quote that kind of summarizes like, this is not old. This is not evolution. This is actually looking like maybe it's not working out. And it was always kind of meant to be experimental. And we're showing all of the signs that the experiment is failing.
Yeah, and speaking as a United States citizen, we don't always change that type of stuff. I mean, I'm sure we're going to go on to in the next section here as to why this change was made. But once changes are made in the United States, we tend to be very stubborn and very unwilling to change policies that don't work unless something catastrophic happens.
Right, because in America, we have an identity built around the American dream. And anything that we have tied to that that gets challenged as failing effectively acts as identity threat on our culture. Because I think something that we've really brought up lately is something that works on the individual scale psychologically, likely can be applied to us socially because we are social animals. Right. So I think anytime somebody says that this isn't working with the whole nuclear family thing, there's like almost that, well, I've been told that if it's not working, I am failing. So, what made it look like it worked, right? Because it didn't fade out gradually. It was demolished by a specific set of policy decisions in like a 30-year window.
This is where we're going to join Marjorie Taylor Greene in bad mouthing the boomers.
Well, I mean, us millennials have been bad mouthing the boomers on the internet since before it was cool because, I had the OG Karen. So I got to talk. I still love that her name is Karen.
Uh,
Uh, but
and I found out
anyway.
I
Oh,
found
go
out.
ahead.
I guess I'm in that weird little area of Gen X that I guess I can consider myself a zillennial. It's it starts with an X, but it's like I'm part Gen X, but also part millennial as well.
And see, but yet I'm supposed to be sort of looped in with that too, because the geriatric millennial, which was on top, that was a label that we got hit for a hot second until all those millennials went, "What the fuck did you just call me?" Geriatric's not an insult, guys. Just gonna throw that out there. But it was just this idea that we are also like that gap, like they were kind of the language gap between the boomers and the millennials in a sense, because it's like the age we were when the internet came out, for example, had something to do with it, of kind of being able that kind of nice blend between those generations. So it's funny because you and I have talked about our age difference quite a bit, and here I'm realizing we've kind of been looped into sort of that same demographic, because I was told, because I'm an older millennial, that I will relate with Gen X a lot on some stuff. And that has been mostly true. And it did support this idea that I was supposed to date older men for a while, but that's beside the point.
Daddy issues. Anyway.
Daddy issues. But yeah, the decline of the multi generational house in America was not a natural evolution. It was the result of a cascade of deliberately constructed incentives that made independent nuclear living artificially cheap and culturally aspirational in the late 1940s and 1950s. Removing all of those incentives, which is essentially what's starting to happen over the decades, and the behavior reverses, which is what we're starting to see now. And I thought it was really interesting that I learned that it was the GI Bill of 1944 was like the single most important policy in understanding this shift, because it provided returning veterans with low interest, zero down payment home loans, which it still does, but with terms that strongly favored new construction over existing housing. Right. So that's what kind of sparked all of this. So developers like William Levitt responded by mass producing identical suburban homes at scale. So, I mean, at the peak of it, a home was being completed every 16 minutes. That's not for nothing.
Look at It's a Wonderful Life. That was kind of that movie was made right around the time that the GI Bill, within the first few years of the GI Bill, and kind of showcased some of it, because there were older rich folks like a Mr. Potter back in the day that did, was more than happy to let people, families like live in shacks or anything like that. But then, thanks to the George Baileys of the world, new homes with cheaper loans for people to move out into something better in the sense of, it's not fallen down, not in disrepair or anything like that,
Right.
but yeah. And it kind of mirrors along the what you just mentioned, the real life example. But that is a perfect example right there, that movie, of what the early years of the GI Bill were like.
Yeah. And by the way, like those early homes cost like just shy of $7,000. And that's even comparing to, at the time, a New York City apartment ran $50 per month. So it's like, and it makes sense, by the way, too. Like, I don't think it was super thought out to that level of, hey, let's push people out of the intergenerational home. I think this one here was an innocent looking at it as an investment, right? Because if a bank is going to give money, especially because it's not like they really have the ability to the level of home inspection like we do now, so that they could properly assess how long a home would last, it made sense to insist on new construction, right? The economics were engineered to push people out of dense multi-generational urban living but into isolated suburban nuclear households. And so that's part of where some of the urgency for the pitch came from, right? Just built a ton of homes and now we need to fill them, because these contractors built it with the hopes of actually selling it, not maintaining the debt, in which case you kind of have to convince somebody to take over that debt for you, don't you?
America, everybody.
America. But yeah, by 1960, suburban population had grown from 19.5% to over 30% of Americans, and it kept rising. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 made car dependent suburban living viable at scale. Social Security's expansion made it financially possible for elderly parents to live independently rather than with adult children. Zoning laws in new suburbs explicitly prohibited the kind of mixed use dense housing that had historically supported extended family networks. The multi-generational home didn't die of natural causes. It was systematically defunded and gutted because it made it look really possible and plausible because the government basically went, we're going to support this. And then they supported it for decades enough to get people to feel like this is normal, right? Because, hey, Tim, hot check. Did you live with your grandparents and great grandparents?
Nope.
Yeah, me neither. Mine were in California while I was in Texas. One in California, one in Pennsylvania. So not even close. And that was just my maternal side. The other ones were in Colorado. So yeah, Colorado to Texas to Pennsylvania, they're not calling Nanny and Pappy to come babysit. Right? Like they're way moved away from each other at this point. So it even kind of got incentivized to like move far away because of this. Because now everybody had a car. It was easier to discover and move further out. And again, like it's mixed, right? Because I can't say that it's all bad for people to get out there and get sophisticated, but it did really seem to gut something that was really important for the way we live as humans.
And I think we've talked about it on the show before too, like the Federal Aid Highway Act, that did make this country car dependent. I don't think long term, similar to, the lack of multi-generational homes now, I don't think that has helped this country long term just because economic wise, it costs a lot more to not only buy, but to maintain a vehicle. Like with my financial status being what it is and my knowledge of cars being what it is, like it's not financially viable for me to have a car. Like I could get my hands on one, but even then, like even some of the older cars that I could get rely more upon computers. So even if I did have some basic car knowledge, there's still some things that I wouldn't be able to do unless I brought it to a mechanic of some sort. And I think that's another thing that's kind of put the boot on the neck of kind of poorer people in this country to try and survive. Like it's possible, if you live in a town like Portland, Oregon, with flawed though it may be public transit system that we have, it's possible to live a normal-ish life, to be able to get out there and do the things you need to do. But it's very hard, and with budget cutbacks on TriMet recently, it's getting harder, and people. I think you said it yourself too. Like some of these changes, like the federal highway system, is not a bad thing. Is a great thing that did allow us to get from state to state or across the individual state in a much better, faster way than we had before. But it didn't take into account the negatives in how it would affect the poorer people in society, and a lot of times the poorer people are going to be the minorities, and not
Right.
the white guys like me.
Right, even though there are a lot of white guys like you that are broke, but
Of
and a
course,
lot
of
of it
course.
is because of this system, right? Because like even before researching this episode, by the way, like the Reverend's tinfoil hat being fully adjusted and fitted to my current bang structure, what kind of told me that it made sense how we got here, that it felt very marketing influenced, right? Because anytime something is going wrong, or that at least helps maintain an economically struggling populace, I go, well, who makes money off of it? I think it's pretty damn easy to see apartment complexes, so our bigger like residential companies make money off of this. Electric, so ultimately big gas and coal make a lot of money by convincing us all to live apart. Look at cars, like, and that's even more because when all of this started, we didn't have dual income homes. The dual income home of like the husband and the wife, like just talking about your standard family build, because this is going back in history, right? Like they did not both work when this first started. Part of this whole American dream, thinking of Leave It to Beaver times, was, the mom stayed home and took care of the household and did everything, right? So the whole now we've got two cars because cars are affordable. So mom can work too, and mom can take the kids to daycare because right, that traditionally that's where that all fell on first. Now it's getting a little bit more diverse as far as who takes the kids where and who's staying at home and who's doing things. But the case I'm trying to make is there's a lot of money by convincing us that we need the nuclear home to succeed as this visual for America being great. but it seems to have caused like a lot of damage, right? Because the cultural mythology did as much damage as the policy. The policy decisions created the material conditions for nuclear family living, right? Television and advertising created the aspiration. In the mid 1950s, we had the shows, like I said, Leave It to Beaver and the Donna Reed show, and they were actively constructing the cultural image of what a healthy, successful American family looked like. And that is a single family home with a male breadwinner, a female homemaker, children who are amazing and never really seem to have a tantrum on TV, and no grandparents in sight. That image became aspirational in a way that made multi-generational living seem backwards or like you were failing. And we can even fast forward that, right? Because think of the big Matthew McConaughey movie, Failure to Launch, right? We even made what sounds like really good, almost psychological speak terms for this. Failure to launch, which really is just a failure of the experiment that never really had historical or cultural backing. We
Right,
had no reason
right.
to think this was better.
Yeah, I mean, at least thankfully today we can look back at some of this stuff like Leave It to Beaver, the Donna Reed show, and see it for what it is, like hot garbage. I mean, those shows were boring, had zero to no conflict whatsoever. I mean, at least Leave It to Beaver did have Eddie Haskell, who could be somewhat, humorous at times. But having said that, like I'm looking, I've always looked at that through the lens of at least today, even in the '80s, looking back on Leave It to Beaver, it was cliched, boring, and just not based in any sort of reality. But I was looking at it through those lenses, not in the lens of seeing it for the first time on TV and thinking of it as kind of this aspirational thing that I'm sure people at that particular time were, because in the '50s it was the boom. Sorry, but lack of a pun there, I guess, the boom time of when this type of living was first really encouraged in the country.
Right. And the mythology of independence as a developmental virtue has done like a lot of cultural work here because it goes back to like failure to launch, right? The idea that any young adult who lives with their parents, except for women for some reason, I feel like females get a little bit of a pass on it more than dudes do, but that you are somehow less mature, less successful, or less adult. And that is not a universal human belief. That is very specifically American, I found out in kind of looking at it. Specifically, we go back into post World War II beliefs. In most of the world and most of history, adult child living with and caring for aging parents was a sign of virtue, not failure.
I remember trying to date this woman when I was living with my mother in my early 20s, when my mother was going through the early stages of her brain tumors, and this woman giving me shit for living with my mother, but I was living with her because she needed someone there. Right, like I had my own
Right.
job, my own money, but she had to look down on me, and no, I didn't marry her, folks.
Spoiler alert, that one didn't pan out.
Yeah, thankfully there, but I remember that like it was yesterday, and it's just like, what is wrong with you as a human being to make fun of somebody that wants to help out a relative of some sort like that? Like
We have a real loneliness epidemic in our elderly. Like that's not a secret. And this also kind of shows like what kind of birthed that, because that is not a situation that has always been, right? And I think a lot of the reason that the the internet trolls that happen to be of the baby boomer generation, I feel, are kind of some of the worst ones out there. Because and I almost wonder and can't help but draw the conclusion anyway that that has to do with social isolation and how they've kind of found like in groups, as it were, on the internet, that even though those are few, it's going into that thing of like, well, this person is agreeing with me and therefore I am right. Whereas whenever you lived in a multi generational home, I will get it by the end of this episode, folks. I'm just going to start calling it the MGH just to stop myself. Okay. So when you live in an MGH, it kind of gives you a variety of perspectives to go against, right? Because unfortunately, what's sometimes happening with our elderly folks is that when they get isolated, they're getting into some of these really kind of hard line beliefs, right? Like, I think about my own biological father, for instance. When I was younger, he was like the one watching the History Channel and the one like really wanting to understand others' cultures. But then I feel like as he got older and retired and stopped being exposed to a variety of people, the tone has kind of changed a bit. I'll put it that way. Might be wearing more of a red hat at certain political events. I don't know what he's up to these days. But yeah, I do think very obviously this has led to a lot more issues than our economic situation right now.
Well, I think that you can also parallel that too. I mean, if you look at the 2024 election, it was a fact that it was young men that were one of the groups of people out there that helped create what we're facing in the White House again, thanks to people out there like your Joe Rogans or your other podcasters out there. And I think it does kind of go along with what you're talking about here, because these young men were pushed out of the home at an early age and had to fend for themselves. They went and, looked for voices that seemed like they knew what they were talking about. And, unfortunately, some of those voices that they heard were giving them very bad information. And, which is why we're now in the state that we're in, which doesn't mean that, if there were MGHs still today, that these people would somehow magically be progressive or something like that. It's still very much possible that that family unit would still be on the conservative side, but at the very least, to your point, I think it would be a lot less extreme. And I know we've talked about, when it comes to like social media and the internet and stuff like that, that's going to be a topic we're going to be diving into a little bit more further down the road here. But like that does not help with this situation.
I think you are also more likely as a human, from what we understand, right? With psychology and sociology and all that, you're more likely to listen to people that you have a built baseline of trust with, right? So honestly, I would almost want to preface, I haven't looked at any of these studies because I didn't prepare for this tangent, but I would almost be willing to bet that the elderly or just really anybody in the family, like I don't want to just stick it on elderly, but I think you're more likely to have influence when you have that base of trust and relying on each other and kind of that kind of like good strong bond that comes from living in close vicinity, right? Like you're more likely to trust those people, I think, with different opinions. Meanwhile, the internet kind of has given us this open window to find anybody who can agree with us. Now, that's different. You don't necessarily trust the person that's agreeing with you. The person agreeing with you just feels good and it makes you feel validated.
And also, too, I think back to my computer repair days when I had a number of older folks coming in, dealing with the aftermath of scams that they got involved in, unfortunately, because they didn't know any better. And if MGHs were still a thing, you would have grandpa going to his grandson or granddaughter and being like, "Hey, I got this text message asking me to send money to an African prince." Then you would have a family member saying, "Don't do that. Don't do that." And that's
Right.
not happening today. They're getting, screwed over for silly. It's silly things, but it's silly to us because we, run across this stuff enough to know it's silly. But for an older person who may just pick up a computer device to be able to send the occasional text message to a family member or to check an email or to do a Facebook, as they would call it.
To do a Facebook.
Yeah, to them, they're not going to know. They're not savvy on this stuff, and that is another drawback right here.
Right. And see, this is kind of, I brought up this term before that I just feel like I had made up at some point. It's totally possible other people have thought of it, but toxic individualism in America, right? I feel like I've talked about that here. If not, I know I've talked about it personally because it is something I have felt for a long time. And this apparently was some of what started that. There was a social psychologist I came across in all this named Hazel Marcus, and she researched cultural models of selfhood like across different cultures. And the dominant American model, where the self is defined by separateness and autonomy, was kind of what she had found. And it's dominant in most, like, it's dominant here. Like it's kind of this thing. And so you can see where if you are identifying as like a good American or what have you, or if you have been taught that you need to identify as independent, well, of course, the parent isn't actually going to ask you for help with the phone thing, with understanding the princess scamming them for money. Also, think of other things that get solved that reduce scam and danger by living together. How many elderly folks are found like that they have passed by themselves at some point because maybe it should have been more than a nurse that visited them every other day?
Wasn't it Gene Hackman who passed away and people found out like a week later because like nobody went to his home?
Something like, I mean, that happens though, and it's gutting and it's so sad, but it happens. And there's also kind of a point of if that individualism is that important for that person because they have been told that it is important that you are successful. If you identify as a successful person in this culture, you shouldn't need that. And so it's like essentially choosing that because you need to identify more with this idea of being super independent than actually letting people care for you as you get older. And like, or that it's successful because you can pay somebody to essentially like you're paying to live in a place where you can. Right. And then, of course, there's the richer end of that success where you are so wealthy that you can have in home care all of the time.
And I think too, it is kind of it affects younger people as well because I think of my oldest. My oldest does pretty well for himself, but like anybody, at times needs some help, and he will reach out to me for financial help, and I'm glad to help him out. But he always is like, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry to ask. You know, I'll make sure not to ask in the future." And I'm like, "Ask me." Please ask me. If I have the ability to help you out financially, I'm going to do it because I think that's what a parent is for, right? I mean, like if you have the financial ability to give your like if you have the ability to give your kid a couple $100 and that's going to make sure they're able to pay their rent on time, you're going to do that as a parent. Now, having said that, if you think your kid is going to use that money to buy like crystal meth or something like that, different story altogether. But you know, my kid is for a 25-year-old relatively responsible and all that stuff and all that and it's like in this culture we do make it hard for people to ask, and that is a problem too. And I think that is another thing that's kind of a beacon of light of why multi-generational homes, and I can't even say it now, thank you.
See, guys,
um
it's a tongue twister. I didn't
yeah.
realize that when I was building this, like, Jesus. Anyway, but, and then also, and I know this is an extreme example, and I want to preface when I say this that I am not blaming the family, right? I think it's pretty clear the Reverend Tracy and these topics, I am not blaming individuals for ever making choices that have been culturally normalized, right? But look at Nancy Guthrie. She was an 84-year-old woman, and the first thing that I felt that came out was that she couldn't have just left on her own, that she required medication, where, like, if she's missing, because this was the kidnapped, the mother of the NBC News anchor, that was kidnapped and still has not been found, to my knowledge. And actually, just a quick little Google, they're still considering searching for her and combing through tips on this. But I'm really aware of kind of what those neighborhoods look like in Arizona that mother was living in independently, and I'm throwing that in quotes, but it kind of seemed like maybe she should not have been. And I'm not saying that that is what resulted in her being taken by any means. I'm saying when I heard the response from the family of, oh my gosh, she's missing, and here's how we know that she had to be taken. To me, I go, wow, and this is even a conversation I've had with my mother-in-law because as she's gotten, retired and stuff, I want her to know her options, right? That we don't have to like stick to this stupid model. If it doesn't work, if she wants to come soak up time with her grandbaby, she can. But basically, like, it made me go like, wow, that kind of sounds like some of the points that I've made about elderly folks maybe not actually being in a good place to live independently like this, but yet are because it is that important for their identity.
Which can lead to bad things. Like I know my mother for the longest time with her brain tumors kind of fought that idea of, needing help. Granted, the thing that was eye opening for her was when she decided she was going to drive to my sister's college graduation. When she was in the early stages of the brain tumors, and luckily she was able to go down there because from Grand Rapids to Berrien Springs is like the middle of this. Think of it in simple terms. It was the middle of the state from Grand Rapids. She had to drive to essentially the bottom of the state and back. Which, if you are in full physical and mental faculties, can be a stressful ride. Because being drivers, it's going to be bad. But when you're just in the early stages of brain tumors, frightening stuff, and that was the thing that kind of woke her up. But like, she could have gotten into an accident, she could have died, if she could have got lost and not know where to come back, because this is like the early stages of her like writing up a grocery list for me to go to the store, and every single word written down was gibberish. She knew
Man,
what
yeah.
she wanted, but corn was just four random letters put together. And she fought it and fought it and fought it. And I think it is part of this whole mindset that people have of what being an American really is, and that is sad in a lot of ways.
Right, because we've been told to be successful, these things. And that's really just as simple as it is. And we've gone through like how influential our television is. It is exactly why people who are bigots against the queer community get so upset over things like Paranormal Park, which features a transgender kid, and it kind of gets touched on. They didn't like an owl house, that they had to go and make it woke because Luz came out as being bisexual, when really, like, I feel like those are some of the greater examples of just normalizing. But that's why they don't want it normalized. They don't want it to be accepted, and that's why they push against it so hard. They use the educational pivot of like, we shouldn't be sitting kids down and talking to them about this and causing a confusion and da da da. Like, they use that as their pitch. And that's the one where I've said in episodes past, I kind of see their point there. But what's sad is they're using that as the argument to not allow any level of normalization of it. Because they're like, well, they're pushing for these things, so therefore get rid of all of the things, right? The all bad. The in and out
Yeah,
group says get rid of all of the stuff they want because they want this thing. And we feel like we're making a clear argument that that's bad.
yeah. Because we've talked about it before. Like, there are times to where Hollywood can be heavy-handed with a message to the point to where it becomes saccharine and like an after-school special, and nobody is benefiting from that. But when the situation is similar to like one of the Doctor Who specials from a couple of years back, to where the doctor, initially said, hey, what is his name? And somebody pointed out, hey, we don't know if it's a boy or a girl yet. And the doctor goes, oh yeah, what are you? To try to get the aliens pronouns at that point. It was just that simple discussion somehow set some people off. It's like,
Yeah.
why we can't have that? That's too well. It's just like, shut up. That's just common courtesy more than anything. And you're telling people that's woke? Screw off.
Yeah, It's Pat couldn't be made today because somebody would just like, so what are your preferred pronouns? Like, are we just mad that we couldn't do a remake of It's Pat? Somebody really had been bankrolling this project and went, oh man, we can't do that.
Oh, man, didn't I believe Quentin Tarantino might have helped with writing that script. He was friends with Julia Sweeney. Julia Sweeney actually showed up in Pulp Fiction near the end of the movie. Side tangent, yeah.
Super funny. I almost want to check. I was like, did Quentin Tarantino help write that? But I mean, I'll believe almost anything you tell me with like assurance, because that's how that works in the brain. But yeah, so it's like we've kind of talked about a lot of the, I feel, less obvious drawbacks, but let's talk about the cost of living argument, because that is the most immediate thing that I think we can all come to. Like I said, my early tinfoil hat on this with doing no research was that, wow, this seems to be really expensive, because this cost is not subtle. The independent living experiment was built on a specific economic foundation: affordable housing, single income households being sufficient, and geographic mobility making job opportunities accessible enough to justify leaving your family network. right? That was the recipe that cooked. That was great. But the problem is time took away certain ingredients. We made some swaps, and now our review is a 1 star saying, I don't get why this tastes like garbage. That's what I feel like is kind of going on right now, because the experiment's material conditions no longer exist, but the cultural expectations around it do, and that gap is what is producing the real harm right now. It's like we got housing affordability has hit a 40-year low in 2023, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. Nearly half of young adults aged 18 to 29 do currently live with their parents now, and that's not a level seen since the Great Depression. In 2024, 17% of all homes purchased were multi-generational, the highest share since the National Association of Realtors began tracking this data. And the behavior is already changing, the culture just hasn't caught up. So it's kind of funny that we have this quiet movement, like more people are starting to move in, but yet the cultural expectation and the message that's still out there is that you are failing as a parent if your child doesn't move out at 18, and you are failing as becoming an adult. You are failing as a child becoming an adult by not moving out at 18, because that pressure is still very much alive.
And yet, financially, it's just not possible. I mean, think about all the fantastic loans we can give 18-year-olds to go to college that bury them in debt for many years. Probably,
Right.
for a lot of them, a majority of their life. You're pointing to yourself as I
I
say
am.
that.
Yeah. I remember, like, because I moved 6 hours away from my college, and I remember when the dorms got full, the counselor told me, cute little suggestion, life hack. You can actually just choose to max out your student loans and use it for housing and groceries. And don't think about how you're going to have to pay this back for the rest of your fucking life later. Just think about how you don't have to move in with other people. You can live by yourself if you wanted. And actually, there were apartments that worked with that would even set you up with more or less a dorm mate situation. Like we had our own rooms and our own little private bathrooms. It was called like University Point or something. Like they were very clear as to what they were doing, and they would allow you to just pay for the entire like quarter or 6 months or whatever, because they know that that's what kids were being convinced to do, is to take out the max and loans. They wanted to get your money ahead of time so that you didn't mismanage your money, as was already considered normal with my millennial, early aught kids coming up in the world. But yeah, like it's really funny because they've had to make policy after policy to try to protect people, but yet we still push student loan debt. And one thing that they used to do at college campuses that got kiboshed was they used to have like booths with credit card signups, because they would get all of these kids to sign up for credit cards and be like, yeah, go spend your $500 at Victoria's Secret or whatever. There's your line of credit. But when you get like a dozen different cards with a dozen different low balances, you get convinced, oh, well, this is good because you've had them each as individual conversations, right? Psychology of money side tangent here. So they used to be allowed to do that. They're not allowed to do that anymore. But yet we still do this thing. Yeah, housing affordability has completely tanked. And we have actually, the number of people living in multi generational houses quadrupled from 1971 to 2021. So that's a really significant like jump backwards, right? That's like 18% of the US population, apparently. And that's like among 25 to 34-year-olds specifically. Couldn't I didn't dig into it enough, I should say. I probably could have found it if I'd tried harder. I wanted to see if that was like a whole, like they moved out and moved back in, because I thought the ages there were interesting to give, of 25 to 34.
With some of the economic things we faced, I mean, look at 2008, for example, with the housing crash. I mean, there were a lot of people at that time that did have their own homes that were suckered into ridiculous loans that most of them didn't necessarily need, that helped spur that crash on, that had to move back in with parents. I mean, maybe it was for a temporary situation, but it happened. And, we've had plenty of other economic downturns since then, thanks Trump. and like it happens. And like, yeah, to your point, like the more it happens, the more it becomes normalized, and the more it becomes normalized, the more, hopefully things can change down the road, because there is benefits. Like, you don't have to take on so much economic risk if you do have a support system in place of that multi-generational home. You're contributing, and think
Right.
of, even if something as simple as, like in Portland here, it's infamous for a lot of people having roommate situations. That helps, I mean, that should be a big benefit of showing why the MGHs actually work, because if you have more people living together in a space, then it's going to be a lot easier to keep things up and running.
Exactly. Like closeness matters, right? I know Tim and I are already spitballing future episodes where we're going to talk about the illusion of social media, but being close to people is a major factor, not only in your mental health outlook, but your lifelong longevity. Like, I think something that came up, and I might have the numbers further down in my notes because I don't remember if it actually made my final draft, but something like elderly parents who are, or grandparents, I should say, not elderly parents, but grandparents who are actively involved in like regular care of their grandchildren, like live longer. They're way less likely to have dementia or mentally degrading type illnesses. They're just less likely. They haven't fully explained the phenomena, but it seems closely tied to the idea that we are a social species, and this idea of being crazy individualistic is not good, right? And by the way, like, I want to throw it out there just to really drive this point home. The shared living in multi-general houses went from 9% of Americans in 1971 to 25% in 2021. This is not a marginal trend. If you have found that you're living with your parents, I want you to hear one thing today: you are not failing. This is what is happening right now. Okay. And you can breathe in and hopefully take that with some peace if this is your demographic that we're talking about. You are not failing. This is
The
just what's happening right now.
Yeah, I mean, really, the only way if you are failing is if you find yourself like chronically unemployed, but the reason that you are chronically unemployed is that you are not making an effort to be, to be employed at that point. At that point, maybe you're a failure, But if you
Right.
are,
We put a
good.
little hashtag right there, right? Of like that's probably indicating that maybe something is missing, that you have no urgency to go out and do anything, right? Like we can talk about that. That might be mentally health driven, right? But yeah, this is not a marginal trend. This is a structural reversal that has been building for 50 years, and it shows no sign of peaking, which means we're probably that 25% is likely higher now, right? Because these are numbers comparing back to 2021. And so, yeah, just really want to drive home the point on the economic standpoint that if this is an affordability choice for you, you are making a good decision, not just for yourself and your mental health, but also your kids if you decide to extend that downward and continue living in multi-gen with your kids, or at the very least your parents, because you're going to help keep them alive and healthy longer. And I do want to also obviously say that if you had abusive, neglectful, and extremely toxic dynamics in your home, I do understand this sounding like a super unappealing idea. However, going back to some of the history of psychology concepts we talked about, you may want to look at those relationships that you have identified as toxic and ask yourself, are they really toxic? Or did too many memes make it to my feed telling me that my parents are shit because of Y? Challenge those opinions and also ask yourself, are they even the same people they were when that happened, right? We've talked about the evolution of people, etc. So yeah, I'm never going to say that you need to heal with somebody who like abused you if it was that level of anything. But I do want to kind of put it out there that we've talked about our social media is yet another angle in which we kind of get low key manipulated into believing certain things. And I think because of the individualization, when you think about how important it is, you can see where some of those messages going, well, you need to sever your ties. Like, kind of can get exacerbated by the therapy speak being misused, like the online definition of therapy speak versus the real therapy speak.
Right. And also, too, I think, I think I could speak for you here that you're also not proclaiming that, you shouldn't take advantage of some of the things that we have out there for support. I think of Bruce Willis. His family moved him into a separate home, which I believe is just like like a house or two over. So it's like in the same neighborhood, but with his medical condition being what it is, he needs that specific. He needs a place to where he can have like 24/7 medical care because his family at that time did not have the tools available to properly take care of him. And that is a good thing. Tools are
Right.
meant to be used properly and should be supported and all that stuff. So there are always going to be exceptions to the rule. I mean, because like with an MGA situation, you're not going to be able to take care of everything. And, if we can take advantage of some things we have in the 21st century here to support that, by all means, take advantage of that. But, on the flip side, there are certainly benefits that can help us out. And Bruce Willis, of course, lots and lots of money. So, his situation is going to be like different than yours or mine. But
Right. We go
that,
into that. It didn't get replaced unless you had the money to replace it.
right.
Right? Either financially or institutionally, I think is what I had said earlier, financially and institutionally. So obviously financially he's got it. And I think it took you saying that like took me back to a joke from Natasha Leggero because she's very famous. Like, I'm not going to have kids. She likes to do this kind of, I feel it's a snooty character when she does her stand up. But she was, who's going to take care of you when you're older, Natasha? And her joke is like, what? You think I'm going to give birth to geriatric nurses? And and it's like, and it's funny to a point, but yeah, no, like highlighting that obviously there's going to be situations, right, where you're going to bring somebody in to do certain levels of care if that's necessary. But you still have to think of how much of a financial burden it is to have to deal with those issues, as well as slowly depleting your retirement faster than you are supposed to because of this idea that you being successful means you've put over $1 million aside so that you can afford to live by yourself. And meanwhile, it's like, my gosh, could you imagine if Social Security got to feed in to the MGH, to a multi-generational home of like where you could almost look at it as your parents are in a way being paid to kind of stay home and help with some of the house care. But see, they don't even have to do that all the time. I think it would really free them up to be able to explore more of their social hobbies. Like something like it's no secret. I really do love my mother in law to death. And I will put it out here on the show that I would be thrilled if she ever decided to take us up on the offer of, hey, if you sell your house there, or even just put it up for rent, like let's just go in, let's buy a house. Like how great that could be. Because, for example, she doesn't like driving. And one of the things she said, she doesn't like feeling like she's got to be the man of her house. Well, I'd be the man of that house. I'll mow the lawn. I will put on my chores and get out there and get after it and sweat and not even think twice about it. You want to know why? Because I have a trustworthy adult that my son and my kids trust implicitly and aren't going to also get emotionally wrecked by that, because we can now also kind of get into the other thing we've touched on, which is the loneliness and mental health data correlates directly with the decline of extended family networks. So losing that grandparent element, not to mention that it used to be grandparent, great grandparent. You know what I mean? Like it used to be so big. And as I learned in this research, it used to even include completely non blood related people. So, how did that start, right? So, and it really does correlate with the timelines that we've already talked about. The Surgeon General declared loneliness a public health epidemic in 2023. I remember that. That feels important to us, right? Because it almost felt like they wanted to blame the pandemic on it. That's the way I remember that report coming out. What about you? Because it's like this is recent enough in history that we should realistically know kind of what we thought when they said it. And that was my first thought, was I almost thought it was because of the pandemic or what they were trying to blame on the pandemic.
I think that definitely had something to do with it. Like myself, I did personally take it more in the broader sense, but I think it was something, a spotlight that the pandemic kind of made it very clear needed to be addressed in some way, shape, or form. So, yeah, again, at the end of the day, I think it was due to the pandemic that we had this, but it was not solely about the pandemic, if that makes sense. It shone the light on it to the point to where I felt they needed to publicly address it.
Right. And it really did shine a light on a lot of things, I feel like. Right. And I felt like they really wanted it to be the scapegoat, but the timing isn't coincidental. The decades that saw the greatest expansion of nuclear family only living, and that's roughly 1950 to 1980, they also saw the steady dismantling of the informal social support networks, I should say, that multi-generational living provides. We replaced those networks with nothing and then spent decades being surprised that people were lonely.
Imagine that. Imagine that.
I know, because it goes back into think about what the MGH gave us. That isolated nuclear families just don't and can't in the same way. Built in childcare, elder care that doesn't require institutional outsourcing, daily intergenerational contact that research consistently shows benefits both elderly and the young. You had a shared economic burden and the simple neurological benefit of living with people who are attached to you. Every one of those things has downstream mental health implications when it's absent. That's for everybody. That's the kids and the elderly. And we're not even touching about the us, the people in the middle, right? Like we're really talking about the things that I feel I wanted to focus more on the things that I feel like we've actually talked about. Right? I feel like we've talked more about the elderly loneliness epidemic and children dealing with anxiety and depression issues like we've never seen. And I'm saying this is all tied to that.
Well, think too about something as simple as childcare. Like if you're a first time parent, everything seems kind of scary. Whereas if you have somebody that has more knowledge about child rearing, even if it's something that's 20 years or so in the past, they're going to have a lot more common sense to tell you that it's okay to do this. The baby's not going to explode, type of deal.
Exactly.
And because like I remember when my daughter was born, how gingerly I changed the diapers. It's like I don't want to hurt my baby. But then when my youngest son Luke was born, it's just like up you go, take the diaper off, blah, and
Oh, yeah.
it's like little things like that an older parent living in the home, I wouldn't want my mom living with me. That's a different story altogether. But an older parent living in the home ideally would be able to say, okay, you don't have to be that ginger. You want to do this, that, and the other thing, and blah blah blah. And that level of knowledge is not necessarily there. Like, sure, maybe you can get it via text messages or phone calls or like a FaceTime call or something like that. But getting that one-on-one support in person means a lot.
Right. But doing it over text because that communication is inherently flawed, I think is causing more of the divide and more of this idea that that person over there is toxic than if they were in the same space regularly. Right? Like, granted, yeah, that still exists with the mom that lives up the road, right? But that's also kind of going in and ties back to where our history of psychology comes in on this, because kind of the fortunate truth, because there's good from this too. So I don't want to pitch it as all bad, but when you're on your mommy groups and you're venting about your mother, or especially delicious, pissed off at your mother-in-law. Oh, that is just yum in mom groups for some reason. They love that shit. Like that wasn't taught in movies, right? Um, but you're going to get those people empowering you, like, yeah, she's such a bitch. Like, unfortunately, that is also, as I've mentioned in a prior episode, the problem with some of the chatbots with teens is because when you are only empowered and you are never challenged, when you don't have that devil's advocate, when you don't have somebody making you think about your decisions and is only like saying, yeah, you a rock star, that's not good for you. It's really bad for adolescent brains. We're learning that on a huge short term learning curve right now because of the expansive AI bots. But it's not good for anybody to only have yes men in your life, right? And I can't help but think that is feeding in to parent bad, because there is good knowledge from things that they did. Granted, The other part of that, though, is what we've talked about with kind of our boomer generation is they really identify as being good parents. And there's a lot of messaging out there that makes them hard to accept that just because they did something a certain way, I spanked you and you turned out fine, doesn't mean that knowledge shouldn't help pivot what we do. And I even see that between the Mr. Reverend having his two kids that are older and the stuff that I bring to the table being a psychology and family studies nerd of he now more understands like hugging the baby Reverend during a tantrum is going to serve him with regulating way faster and way better than this idea that we were drilled in that it is all discipline, that it has to be discipline that you are teaching your kid, because if you have an undisciplined child, you're going to have a child that gets into trouble. So again, some of that comes naturally, but we do need to be open to each other. And I think that's some of the stuff with the identity threat in our families that makes it harder. But I do feel that if we can understand these things and talk about them, maybe we can start to break down some of these barriers, right? But I wanted to go into, before I accidentally forget, that there was a meta analysis of over 148 studies covering over 300,000 participants that found that social isolation increases mortality risk by roughly 29%. And that's comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So this is not just wrecking our economic health and our physical health. It is, well, our mental health. It's wrecking our physical health because it's wrecking our mental health. Because I think something that we've really driven home on FTN is that those two things are very much interconnected, more so than we want them to be. Right? It's why pulling yourself up by your bootstraps doesn't fucking work. Many, many studies say doesn't work that way. You cannot willpower past mental health, especially if that's the thing getting in your way. There is an element to fake it till you make it, but ultimately you need support.
Yeah, and isolating yourself from humanity is not the way to get that. And being a misanthropic recluse myself, I know there are times to where I will find the easier route of trying to be alone and whatnot, but that leads to bad things down the road, So you do have to find some level of support. And it doesn't have to be a huge network at all, trust me. But, having a network helps.
Literally any close tie network, chosen family, etc. I know people thought I was a weirdo because with my first marriage, I had a roommate. And honestly, I would do it again. The Mr. Reverend and I, you were our roommate. People thought that was strange. But I think that it does do something good to have more people in your household. And it would be great if we hadn't stripped away the MGH as badly, because it goes back into the loneliness epidemic, kind of really affecting our elderly generations. Yeah, effectively, the elder care crisis is a direct and predictable consequence of removing elders from family structures. The nuclear family model requires a solution to elder care that the multi-generational home provided for free. And really kind of for free-ish, because then it solved another problem of childcare, right? Like we just talked about that. So not only was it free, it actually offered a side benefit. So it's actually better than free in a way. But basically, who takes care of aging parents when they can no longer live independently? The answer the nuclear family experiment produced is the nursing home industry. That is a 175 billion sector built on the premise that professional strangers can substitute for the intergenerational care relationships that humans evolved to provide and receive. And I think that's almost like some failure to thrive with some elderly folks that end up in these homes, because we talk a lot about childcare places and them like, oh my god, did you see what this care person did to this kid, and did you see that? And gosh, what was it, Happy Gilmore kind of touched on it like in a comical way. But what's sad is that situation exists, and it's not completely unlike viewing these humans as something to be stored, kind of going back again, like where this partners super well with history of psychology of asylums and etc., right? Like when people become unuseful or damaging to society, our solution seems to be to try to storage them. And unfortunately, the way that we deal with people that makes them more convenient to storage them can sometimes be found to be not so great. right? Like sometimes they do get mistreated. Sometimes they get sedatives in their medication to make them easier to deal with and such like that. Like we hear about these things happening. We just don't highlight it as much because in America land, we do have a big identity around thinking and protecting our children. Kind of funny considering what's going on right now, but we do still identify as that. And I honestly think that's part of the problem with the Epstein files is nobody wants to accept that happened because we identify as wanting to protect children. But that's a different story. Different podcasts are covering the Epstein files. We don't need to go into that one.
Yeah, that's a rabbit hole like I think we could talk a lot about.
But yeah, and so you can see like economically, right? It's very clear to put numbers to this because 70% of Americans over 65 will need some form of long-term care, right? In the effect of not being able to live alone and make sure they're staying on top of their meds and make sure that they're cleaning the house and make sure that they're emptying any litter boxes or taking care of any companion animals. Think about the things that when somebody walks into a home and says, you must live with help now, those situations.
Yeah, and it's like, to be clear, like there are nursing homes out there that are run correctly, that treat the people nice and all that stuff, and that's great. And more often than not, I can probably say that, more often than not, most nursing homes are going to be run correctly and treating people great and all that stuff. It's more the exceptions to the rule that do become the problem. I did in my high school years work briefly at a nursing home in the cafeteria section, and after about a month, I could not stand it anymore just because of how bad that place was run in Grand Rapids. And when it is run badly, when it is just a storage place to keep people out of society or something like that, like we do have this mindset too in this country of out of sight, out of mind. And why are we doing that to people that we love?
And it costs so much, right? Like the annual median cost of a private nursing home room in 2024 was over $100,000. So
Which
that's
in
every year. And right, that's where it's like, oh, you have to put aside millions now because not only are you trying to factor in like your home, like as long as you can live independently, you're now also having to factor in that at some point you're going to have to pay somebody to house you and make sure that you're doing all the things and cleaning up the stuff, right? That's a very quantitative thing, a number, a cost, but it's not considering the emotional cost. Placing a parent in a facility, the guilt, the distance, the cognitive decline that research shows accelerates in isolated institutional settings. Like that's separate and additional, and it's harder to quantify because it's not a number. But research consistently shows that elderly people living with family maintain cognitive function longer, report higher quality of life, and have significantly lower rates of depression than those in institutional care or living alone. And that's pretty fucking significant. And you have to think of, well, then there's probably costs with that too, right? Even if it's not like the directly easy to relate one of, well, they're paying for therapy, right? Because let's be real, they're probably not paying for therapy, but they probably are using their money. Like, think of the grandparents that get guff because all they ever do is send stuff to my kid. Well, what do we understand about retail therapy? It doesn't have to be for you to feel good. So see, and sometimes the elderly generation is also like, well, why the fuck do I care if I max out credit cards? What are they going to do? Come after my income? They can't. So sometimes they get into these situations where their kids are like, what have you done? But really, now that we kind of talk about all of the things that are going on, that it's not just a financial burden, it's also an emotional drain. It's also causing cognitive decline, which is also going to make them make emotional based decisions and not go through the logic check of, but should I get my son, my grandson, the super awesome Xbox with 3 years of infinity games? Like they just want to do it because it feels good and it gives them that sense of providing something for a generation that maybe there is some wiring there that they should want to care for their grandkids. Call me crazy. I can see it with how we understand how human brains work. right?
Well, and look at what you said about nursing homes. You know, having the average cost be about $100,000 a year. Like, I'm going to be 50 this year. You know, I'm in good health, and I expect to be in good health for the foreseeable future. But there could be a time to where I could find myself needing a situation like that, and in my current financial situation, that's not going to happen. And you know, it's like kind of scary because it's not going to happen for a lot more people than just me. I mean, my finances are what they are thanks to the choices I made. You know, kids don't get married right away. That hurts. But anyway,
Wait.
but
Wait and vet that out. It's okay. There's no rush. Don't get married. Don't have kids right away. That's the big thing, is like they want to push like, people in their 20s aren't having kids. I'm like, but that's actually like for some good reasons. Like some of us are actually pausing and trying to get more into our careers and do it as more of a choice than a whoops. But see, the problem with that is it doesn't keep a certain percentage of Americans poor. And I think tinfoil hat on. Sorry, I forgot to warn you guys that I was adjusting that to my forehead. I do. I think there is like a lot of people who really have a vested interest in keeping majority of Americans poor because it makes that whole like you have to work. Like everybody has to work because we need workers. But it's not really that sustainable because you've taken away the systems that encouraged more people to work. It's like you promised, yeah, we'll do the childcare and the stuff, and then took it away or made it so exponentially expensive that nobody can fucking afford it.
and
But
you're
yeah,
taking away even the basic jobs at this point that people can take to even just barely survive. You know, think like back in the day, you could conceivably work at a big box retailer and make a relatively modest to good, decent living. Whereas today, you could still do that in some places, but you have to become a very bad person to do that. And it's and also too, like the retail model anyway is kind of going the way of the dodo thanks to stuff like Amazon. And when you have these major companies that are switching it to where even some of the basic jobs that people are doing to survive are becoming obsolete, what happens after that?
yeah. Like, and what's funny is it's like we want to blame like AI and certain things for taking some of those jobs, but those jobs have been underfilled. Like they legitimately have been underfilled. And a lot of it is because we have a message that staying in those jobs is a failure. And maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe if a job is identified as necessity, it should make a livable wage, but that's beside the point. Or at least UBH, shout out. But one thing I wanted to make sure I mentioned is there was a 2019 study in the journals of gerontology that found that grandparents who provided regular childcare had a 37% lower mortality risk than non childcare providing grandparents. So that actually means the MGH isn't just good for young adults who save on rent, it's protective for the elderly people who stay in it. It's being shown it is good for grandparents, their mental and therefore physical health, to be involved in the direct care of their kids. And I want to say I've brought it up before, but children actually do better when they're watched by a smaller pool of adults. So this is again one of those things that has like reciprocity. Like the kids are getting something good out of it and the grandparents are getting something good out of it. Even if in your home you have to deal with more like head bumping conversations, which we all know that's actually kind of good for you. If everybody can get on a playing field and do it right, which when you live in a home and you do kind of depend on each other at a level, means that you have to, right? Like when you live together, you have to resolve conflicts. When you live apart, it gets really easy to just stay fucking mad and click all the meme memes and the likey likes and the sherry shares of my mother's a narcissist. You know what I mean? Like I don't know. I feel like these two ending up next to each other, it wasn't planned to tie them together when I started pulling these notes, but it's just so like really affixed my tinfoil hat that I think a lot of the things we're dealing with now, a lot of the hardest challenges in America land were orchestrated. Whether the intention was meant for this to happen and play out the way it has doesn't matter because the impact is most definitely there,
Well,
right?
you could toss if you want. If I put on my tinfoil hat, you could also toss the argument about abortion as well, because if you make it harder for women to have reproductive health services available, it's going to be more likely that more kids are going to be born. And if more kids are going to be born, you're going to have more people kind of stuck in a financial way of life for at least a decade, maybe more, until they're able to get back up, which means that they're going to have to go out and get the first job that they can get that has a, somewhat decent wage and kind of grit their teeth. They're not going to have the luxury to say, this job sucks, I'm going somewhere else.
And think what
So
you can do for your kids, by the way, if they're still living with you. They don't have to be in a job that feels like they can treat them like shit because they're an 18-year-old and they're assuming that they're out on their own and need the money, right? Like you can actually teach your child coworker boundaries and workplace boundaries, that no can mean no. Your kid never has to make a decision of like, well, do I still go to, let's just throw it out there, family reunion, or do I work because they tell me I have to? Right? Like you can actually teach work life balance. I feel better. And you can support your kids like getting out there, and also like the idea of like they don't have to go to college and work. Like college is hard enough as it is. Like I know that's something we have emphasized with both of my bonus babies is if they really do want like a jump start, if they want to come here at 18, absolutely free to. Absolutely free to, because I actually really loved the idea I had read at one point, like just kind of a cool tip of like when your kids turn 18 and they have that little bit of income, charge them rent, but put it in a savings account. And even if it's like a low rent amount and they stay with you for like 5 or 6 years or whatever, they could have a down payment or earnest cash for those that have actually gone through the home buying experience. They can have one of those two things built up a little bit to help them buy a home or at least help them get out into the world. Maybe they can buy their first car instead of like having to lease it, because that's what we've really gotten into is we just start incurring debt at 18 now, because that's what the system has kind of like, you need to do this. And so if you're going to need to do it, well, you need to. So therefore, credit cards and loans and take out the max of your student loan shit. Like that's kind of been the recipe to this disaster, is convincing kids to move out at 18. Because then once you have that separation, I do think it gets harder to move back in, because you had already spent all this time sort of learning how to live with each other and learning each other's quirks. But if you leave for even as few as a handful of years, well, then that home has already adapted to your not being in it, and then you've got the learning curve all over again. Same with
especially,
elderly living independently, right? Like that's even harder because you're older and you're coming back to like living into a group situation.
yeah, and that's not even taking into account parents that still want to treat like their 23-year-old like they're seven still.
Right. And I do wonder if that got exacerbated by your child moving out at 18. Because as much of some of the theory as I've come to understanding, like my own situation with postpartum depression and postpartum anxiety, is I feel like a lot of those urges make sense now, having gone through it. And I think it would be really foolish to think that our brains just accept, well, my child's an adult at 18. I don't think that it's actually a natural thing to accept that. And I think that's kind of what we're getting in here, right? Is that we've just decided 18 is old enough. Even though everybody seems to know 25 is the age that your brain is actually kind of done cooking for being able to understand like long-term consequences and decision making and second and third order effects, right? So I do think that there's like almost a mystery that happens when your kid moves out of, well, how did they handle those years? Right? Like, what do they know all the things they need to know? Because they basically got set off into the wilderness at 18 effectively. And so what do they know now? And I wonder if there's like that part of it. It's almost like some of my logic rocks and my intellectualizing of postpartum depression was the whole like something tells the cat to go home, right? Something tells the cat that it needs to go back and feed its kittens. And I do think in a way, to a level, PPA and PPD is that nagging thing. It's that biological nag that there's a little that needs you. And I just wonder if we will find that that doesn't actually fully stop just because your kid is some magical age, right? Like, I think there is something biologically, neurologically that goes on. And I'm not even saying it's specific to parents. I think fathers are very much part of this too, as they've become more part of child rearing. But I do sometimes wonder if that's part of it. But without going too much further into that, I think now it is safe to get into the psychology of why are we ashamed of this? Why are 18-year-olds ashamed to still be living with their parents? Because, right, I think we already covered. Tim, you're of the age that, right, you got the boot at 18. Is that pretty much your experience too?
Pretty much, yeah. It was like treated like a kid, and then when I turned 18, all of a sudden I needed to find a job right away, and it was just like, whoa, whoa,
Right.
whoa, like
Get a job and get out.
yeah, because you're talking like my mother wouldn't even let me have like a paper route, paper. I couldn't be a paper boy. Yet, all of a sudden I had to, get a job and maintain it to pay some rent, and there was other stuff going on at that time too. That's when my mother's alcoholism started getting a lot worse too. So that didn't help matters either. At age 19, with like virtually no social skills or skills, survival skills, period, I ended up getting my own apartment.
Oh, yeah. So you didn't go into dorm and college living. You went right into solo apartmenting, huh?
Yeah, because I went to the community college route. I didn't go to a standard 4-year college, even though I had the ability and the grades to do so.
Exactly. So, like, you could have, but you went apartment. So you were doing college.
Yeah, for a while, but then I think the drawback of that, I think I would have been a little more successful with college if I went to a traditional 4-year at that age, because of if I had lived on campus in a dorm or something like that, it would have been more like school. It would have been more normal to be able to get up to class, and having to do all that on your own at the age I was at with the level of responsibility I had at that particular time. I was set for failure.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I think we all were set for failure. That's why they tried to get us at 18. I think there's a very specific reason they go 18's good. Let's send them off to college and tell them if they got to pick what their lifelong career is going to be when they don't understand lifelong consequences yet. Anyway, sorry, the timing. My tinfoil hat going to take it back off now. But one of the most interesting things about this topic is that multi-generational living has measurably good outcomes for financial health, mental health, elder care, child development. But yet, like, so there's all of the logic things, right? And I think this also goes into, we've already talked about with identity bias is involved. You're going to take these facts. Like, even though I told people a little bit ago, what you're going through is actually normal, right? We're up to 25% as of 2021. So we're just going to assume, since that was an upward trend, that we're more than 25% are in intergenerational home situations now, right? Even though I said that, there could be somebody who went, well, fuck you, and turned it off, right? They might not be listening to any more of this episode because there is such a significant shame attached to failing at it. I'm throwing that in quotes because it goes back to, we've been told that it's really important to be independent, right? Because adults who still live with their parents are routinely described as failing to launch. So, officially getting into that garbage fucking official sounding term. And that shame is doing real damage, and it's worth unpacking where it came from. And that shame comes directly from the cultural mythology we discussed earlier. That if the definition of successful adulthood is independent living, then not independently living is definitionally a failure. But that definition was constructed in a specific context for specific reasons. And the context has changed and the definition hasn't caught up. And we're still measuring people against a standard that was only normal for 3 decades, just 30 years, 30 in one country for one demographic. And we're still like, I'm not doing it right, so I'm a failure. Like, it's even in the term that we made up, right? Failure to launch. Failing to launch is a bad thing, right? Like, look at what happened to some of the Apollos. Like, you typically want a launch to happen if you're going to launch, right? And then there's also like social comparison theory that exacerbates this, right? And this is back in the 50s. So, right, 1950 to 1980 is when all this spun up. So, it's kind of funny that this is also when social comparison theory came out. In other words, competing with the Johnsons, right? The whole like what your neighbor's doing. But it tells us that we evaluate our own circumstances relative to the people around us and the cultural norms we've absorbed. And as we've discussed, this includes what's getting piped into our TV because our brain responds to it the same way. So when movies like Failure to Launch come out, it goes back to it's funny because we were already starting to fail at this point when that came out. So it's almost like, hey guys, remember this is failure. This is failure. We still try to find ways to like make that the cultural message if that's what you're supposed to be going for.
Even in It's a Wonderful Life, if you remember, before George goes to the bridge, after he finds out that Uncle Billy lost the $8,000, he goes home, and one of his kids talks about the next door neighbor having a new car, and that's when George blows up at the kid, like, "What? You don't like our car? What's wrong with that?" And another early example. Now I'm sure even in like the 1800s, it could be, it could have been what the neighbor has a new cow. You don't like our cow? What's wrong with you? I'm sure that's something that was in society for for millennia before that. However, when you do have the particular social experiment that we've tried here in America with the patriotic individualism being what it is, I'm sure it made that situation a lot worse, because I can I think of me as a kid in terms of not wearing the right clothes, quote unquote, to school. Or, as a parent too, you don't want to you remember what it's like growing up poor yourself, and you don't want to put your kid in that situation. And yet, financially, there's only so much you can do. And that is a horrible feeling. Yet, at the end of the day, parents should be happy that at the very least there's a roof over their kid's head, there's food in their belly, and that they have clothes. Just because they may not have the new Xbox system or something like that, or the new designer shoes or something like that, should be beyond the point. If you can get them, great, but that is not the mark of a successful parent.
Right. That's actually more having to do with our brains. Like human beings, we are considered hardwired for in group and out group behavior because a lot of our evolution and survival really relied on being able to identify like threatening individuals quickly. Right? So it's really just kind of taking care or taking advantage of that brain mechanism when you think about it of, hey, if they've got a car and you don't, you need to understand that you are an out group now. To get in the in group, you need to get in the in group and do what the other groups are doing. So it even comes from that chain effect of when you notice people are having their lawns treated by something, you're more likely to do it. And that's why some of those people go door to door like that. If you can see people getting things, having things that you don't have, you are going to want to do that. And that is because we have a drive of being part of the in group. But I guess in kind of interesting news, and as already kind of leaned towards, it's already reversing. And people are happier, is what's nice. The multi generational home is coming back, and it's not just out of economic desperation. Right? Like, things are getting kind of funky now that they are advertising the speed weave, which was, fun fact, originally made in like the 1940s England to help get longevity out of clothes. But I thought it was really funny that like I started seeing ads for like buying this awesome visual mending tool. And I'm like, I bet that was born out of necessity at some point, and it sure was, Tim. But no, the data on the return of the multi-generational living is it's very interesting. What's more interesting is that when you ask people why they're doing it, the answers aren't only financial. Yeah, like over half people, like 65% or something like that, say that finances are the primary reason. But see, I wonder if that's protective in a way. That's my first little question. But 39% say maintaining close family ties was very important for them. And they saw the value in staying in a home and how that makes that a natural thing, right? Like you're not having to pencil in a phone call if you're having dinner together. You're not having to like orchestrate like having family gatherings on a regular basis when you're planning the menu together as a family, right? So 28% say it's to help with shared responsibilities, and 22% say it's a desire for companionship. People are rediscovering something that was already true. That's how humans function best in a tribe, in a group. We do better.
Imagine that. Imagine that. I mean, it's contrary to this American myth that we've created in the 20th century here, but even with that myth being what it is, we still relied upon other people. Like this whole myth that, like, Bill Gates, for instance, pulled up his bootstraps and was able to do everything on his own. No, he didn't. He had help along the way. Same with Steve Jobs, same with Elon Musk, same with all the other billionaires. They had help. And when you have help, that doesn't mean you're going to end up being a billionaire yourself, but it means you're going to be able to get through this thing called life in a little bit easier way, and yeah, if you're living in an MGH, you're going to be able to, when it comes to, having a date night, it's going to be much easier to say, hey, grandma, can you watch the kids tonight? Sure. Grandpa, can you do this with the kids? Sure. You're going to be able to, have a lot more time with your spouse that way, because there's going to be someone there to help you out. Imagine that.
My gosh, like one of my pitches, like I said, I'm no secret that I'm super open to if my mother-in-law ever wanted to try this, is that the Mr. Reverend and I could actually go on dates, like actual dates, because like, yeah, like we're not rolling in it enough to afford 20-25 an hour on top of what we're paying for our date night. Right? So, like, that's kind of part of that too. But what's kind of interesting in the findings, at least when some of these studies are being done, is that the young adults from age 18 to 29 currently living with their parents. It's striking because this data was pulled during a particularly strong job market. And so, like, it's interesting that that's not because it's not necessarily linked to recession behavior, I guess is what I'm saying, right? Like it would make sense if that uptick was only going up during a recession, but it's kind of still continued to go up. But that's because our recipe got donked with, right? The experiment required affordable housing. And the thing is Susan Watcher at Wharton noted that even young adults with good jobs are staying at home in expensive markets because they cannot afford a starter home. And that is somewhat exacerbated by the fact that they're just not open. And this goes into the fact that the parents that raised us often are staying in those homes. That is part of the problem with our housing right now, is that, and understandably so, they don't want to. They don't want to leave the house with memories of all their kids. Like a lot of them have really good memories in that house. And see, that used to be maintained because it was handed down. And now you're being told, I have to sell this place to strangers and never see it again. And that has to have an emotional toll on somebody who's lived there for decades. Think about that. Granted, a lot of us have been kind of like groomed to move once a year, right? Think about apartment living. You actually lose money usually by staying in a place over years in an apartment because they're going to slowly increase your rent. And then you're not going to be able to take advantage of programs like get 2 months free because you're moving, right? Like, so we've sort of been programmed to move a lot. Like, we don't have a home that we've been in for decades anymore, but they are. And there is now an emotional tie there too. But essentially, the experiment that required affordable living, that was the important ingredient to the recipe, to that sauce that got taken away. And now we're wondering why it tastes like garbage water, right? Because housing is no longer affordable. The experiment is therefore over in large parts of the country, whether or not the culture has accepted it or not. And that goes back to our numbers trending towards more intergenerational living, is showing us in very quantitative ways that this isn't working out. You as an individual are not failing by opting into the MGH. Again, it actually seems like it makes sense. Countries and communities that maintained multi-generational living and never bought into that post-World War II American nuclear family experiment have outcomes worth examining. And I know we don't always like to do that in America land. We don't like to go, well, this works over there, because there's always somebody who's going to want to poke holes in it. But Sardinia, which is part of the study that I brought up at the top of the show, that's one of the world's blue zones with exceptional longevity, and it's notable for its density of multi-generational family contact. South Korea, Japan, and much of Southern Europe, despite urbanization and modernization, have maintained extended family structures and show different patterns of elder mental health and loneliness than the US and the UK. So, looking at other places that literally just never opted into the Kool Aid, never opted into the experiment, looking at how well they are doing, life expectancy, mental health outcomes, child outcomes matters. It matters because it shows just a direct relationship in a sense, right? Like these guys did it, these guys didn't. How are those guys doing now compared to these guys? These guys ain't doing so hot anymore.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, though, I mean, there are a lot of things that have that same type of argument, like universal health care, that you will have people completely dismiss because it's not going to fly in America, and bullshit. It's
Right.
not going to work because people that are in control of the money don't want it to work, because that would mean they would have slightly less billions than they have now.
Right. And it's like we don't even have to look that far, by the way, to see this. It's here too, because we have those small cultures in America. We have Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Black Americans, and they consistently show stronger family based social support networks and, in some studies, better mental health outcomes than their peers in isolated nuclear households. And that's even when you control for income. So the MGH isn't a poverty workaround. For communities that never stigmatized it, it's actually a chosen feature. They choose it. And how often do we loop Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Black Americans as being of a poorer demographic? Granted, they do make up a good amount of it, but I can see where this narrative gets doubled down of, see, those demographics aren't well off. You don't want to do like those demographics. And those demographics do this thing because they must be doing it because they are poor. But meanwhile, they actually see all of the benefit to it, is what it is. They just did not see the benefit to the experiment and therefore never did the experiment. But to wrap us up, to land this so we don't accidentally end up with another 2-hour episode, guys, I'm going to try not to hit you with back to backs on those. But the independent living experiment solved a real problem, but it created new ones, and we are still paying for it. The GI Bill and the suburban housing boom weren't malicious. That goes back to kind of my thoughts. Like, I don't think this was done intentionally, but it still had impact. They solved a real problem. Millions of veterans returning home with no housing and a government terrified of a post war depression. That created a policy. The policy worked for what it was designed to do. The mistake was letting a 30-year window of historically unusual economic conditions harden into a permanent culture mythology about what adulthood and family are supposed to look like. And that's what's kind of making us pay, right? Because every generation inherits the solutions of a previous one. So that's kind of what we are inheriting now. The millennials down are inheriting the fallout of the multi-generational home experiment not being a success, largely because it required continual support by policies and programs that a certain side is constantly arguing to cut, saying that it's our fault and that we have failed. Meanwhile, we never actually had the ability to do that independently. Not people that weren't built into wealth. They could do that, but that was not a game that we actually could do without those programs helping us.
And that's a whole thing of quicksand right there that you can go into as well, because even in the days of when the nuclear family was at its height, I mean, there were still plenty of people that didn't have the financial ability to do that. It's a myth. The nuclear family is a myth. Like, if you were part of a family that was able to pull that off, good for you. Congratulations. You pulled it off. But there are a lot of people in this country that even proclaim to support the nuclear family myth that didn't live in the nuclear family themselves. It's like the people that want to badmouth people on welfare that are on welfare themselves.
Right. And then, it's like the Americans who grew up, like, you realize we're generations separated from seeing multi-generational living as normal, right? Because we have Americans who grew up in the suburbs of the 1950s and 60s, and they didn't experience the nuclear family as like an experiment. they experienced it as being normal at that point. And then that gets transmitted as normal to their children, who then transmitted it to theirs, then et cetera, until now we've reached a generation that is paying $3,000 a month for a studio apartment and wondering why the system's not working, and a power grid that can't sustain, right? Because we are running into that, and therefore power is getting more expensive. And then more people are driving gasoline driven cars from different locations, and that's causing exponential increases in our expenses, right? So I guess in kind of wrapping it up, we can at least take some comfort that the reversal is happening. And if we can help understand that this is not a bad thing, it's just, it is okay to say an experiment is not working, right? On the individual level as well as the cultural level. And if we can start to just untangle that as part of our identity, if we can start collectively accepting that this is not a sign of like health and good necessarily, or at the very least to recognize when it is not healthy and when it is not good for you, right? Because there are people who are totally happy with the independent living style. But I guess the numbers are kind of showing that those are fewer and further between and aren't necessarily as normal. But the reversal is live. 59.7 million Americans are in multi-generational households now. 17% of home purchases in 2024, a generation discovering that the arrangement their grandparents took for granted actually works. So there's starting to be like a going back to this. And the question isn't whether the multi-generational home is coming back. It's whether we can update the cultural story fast enough to stop shaming people for doing something that has been normal for most of human history.
Basically, it's understanding the idea that political ideas can sometimes work in a particular time, but will not always work for eternity. Things need to change based on what the situation is at that particular time. And I think, if anything, that's one thing we try to do on this show too, is try to get people to challenge, those long-standing ideas that they have in their head, because you do have a lot of boomers. Like my aunt, for instance, will be one of the first people. Well, back in my day, it's not your day anymore. It's not your day anymore. It's different circumstances than what you had to face. Because, I mean, we talked about it, like in 1980, you could have a minimum wage job, pay for and own your own home, and send your kid to school on a minimum wage job. You cannot do that today. You can barely do that with a bachelor's degree. Think about that. A bachelor's degree, you could barely get away with what someone that was making minimum wage could do in 1980. This is a different situation, and I think people should open their eyes to the fact that, yeah, things can and do change over time, and you need to be accepting of that. Just because something worked 20 years ago doesn't guarantee it's going to work today.
And just because we moved away from something 20 years ago doesn't mean it's not worth revisiting, though, because that's the counter to that, right? Like that's kind of the opposite on that scale. Is we need to stop blowing that off entirely. Granted, your point is valid. Things are not the same, right? And that deserves to be pointed out to Aunt Sharon. But
that is my aunt's name.
How funny. It's funny, as I also have an Aunt Sharon through my stepmonster. So I don't know, just like this, just random white woman sounding names. That's all my little generating brain was doing right there. But yeah, it's like if people are more receptive to your knowledge if they feel you are receptive to theirs. So unfortunately, cutting off Aunt Sharon gives her that justifiable pushback on you for trying to introduce new information. So see, like it's reciprocal. It needs to go back and forth, but that's the value that we're missing now, because it goes back to, it's so much easier to get empowered nowadays than it used to be. You used to have people that would keep you in check. You used to have friends that would even keep you in check. But now, because of the blessing and curse that is the internet, it is extremely easy to find people who are going to agree with you and empower you on decisions for cutting people off, rather than understanding it is good to have people who challenge your views in your life. They're not all narcissists, right? A little bit of a throwback. Somebody who challenges something you believe is not a bad thing. There are like numerous studies and ancient texts even that will confirm that that's actually a pretty good behavior to have in your life, and really kind of important. I know I devil's advocate just as a default. And a lot of my closest friends know it's not necessarily that it's a view that I hold, well, directly the view that I'm devil's advocating for anyway, but the value that I do hold is encouraging my friends to challenge their beliefs. Like, and you should be able to have like debate level conversations, right? Like, I think there was a reason in debate class you would be assigned a side, right? Because I think there is good in practicing. Okay, well, Aunt Sharon said 20 years ago they did this. Okay, so why did we stop doing that? And if there's a good reason, spanking, for example, we can take that knowledge and work with it and maybe just explain to Aunt Sharon, like, hey, I understand that's how you did things. That's cool. But nowadays, that's just not how it's done anymore. And here's why. And ideally, they're more receptive to it because you were at least open to hearing them and they felt that. Because people aren't dumb, right? We more or less feel it when somebody's more interested in convincing us than hearing us and having a back and forth conversation. And we get immediately defensive to the former.
Well, that was one heck of a wonderful conversation. Thank you for bringing this to us today.
Yeah, and I promise I'll try to have like not like super big things that I feel strongly about so that we don't end up with a lot of super long episodes in a row. But it's something that's been passionately brought up in my life recently. So I'm glad we got to talk about it.
Well, it's like I say too, and I used it in our commercial and everything. But what is nerdiness but being passionate about something that you're interested in? And to me, there is no better thing than to hear somebody that's truly passionate about a topic talk about it, even if it's something that is not necessarily of primary interest to me. I don't have to share that same level of zeal to kind of ride along on that wave, and so thank you for that.
You're very, very welcome. I'm glad I could give that to you.
Yes, we're great partners that way. Well, anyway, thank you all for listening. Next week, we're going to wrap up History Month by talking about why we talk about history and why it's important to talk about history. I think that will be a good way to wrap up the month.
Indeed. I have nothing else to go on about, so I'm okay with just saying farewell to our friends today.
Well, all right. Each Monday, we'll have something in this podcast space to entertain your ear holes. Until we meet again, we bid you adieu.
Visa day. I didn't say that right either.
No, you didn't.
Au revoir.
Auf Wiedersehen. I will say that. Yeah, and you're the German, too. You got German in your family. You should know that.
That's so sad. We clearly assimilated.
Subscribe to Friends Talking Nerdy
on YouTube Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify,
or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Bye, friends.